Hi. Today I want to just drop a quick note before the beginning of the interview to let you in on what is going on for the month of February. In the month of February, we have asked somebody who I've interviewed in the past. His name's Seth Cluett. He's somebody that I really respect, and especially I really love his understanding of the history of all of the art, music, technology world. And I've asked him to sort of help curate a month's worth of interviews with people that he feels are influential today, people who he feels like have a voice that need to be heard, and asked him to help me set up a connection with them and get some interviews in play with them. So with no further ado, let's kick off this February's month of Seth Cluett interviews by talking to Yvette Janine Jackson. Enjoy. Okay, today I get a chance to speak to someone new to me. This is the first of our series of presentations that are being curated by Seth Cluett. And I asked him to help choose and set up these interviews for the month of February. And this is the first of our interviews, and it's with Yvette Janine Jackson. Yvette is a professor at Harvard, but also an artist that has done some extraordinary work in sort of mixed media, theater produced media, acousmatic media work. And so I'm really excited to hear more about the work and about the process that goes into creating it. So with no more ado, let's say hello to Yvette. Hey, Yvette, how are you?
Fine. How are you doing?
Thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to have this talk. I really appreciate it. Why don't we start off by having you talk a little bit about your body of work?
Okay. Well, first of all, thanks for inviting me to have this conversation. My body of work, I've been kind of categorizing into two parts lately. One is radio opera, which started as an acousmatic multi-channel practice. And then the other is narrative soundscape composition, which is another electroacoustic practice. So with the radio operas, they're primarily episodic compositions that are based on some type of historical event or a current social issue.
I find that title actually really compelling. I saw it in some of the information about you that's online, this discussion of your work as radio operas. And in fact, luckily I was able to listen to a couple of things, including the Invisible People episode 1, which was, it's a really compelling work, but it's interesting too, because you posit it as a radio opera, but it's sort of meant to be performed in a almost theatrical space, right?
Right. So the use of the term radio opera it's distinct from like historical uses, like Giancarlo Menotti's early operas that were commissioned specifically for radio. And when I use the term, I'm borrowing radio. It's evocative of the golden age of radio, which I'm a huge fan of radio dramas from the 30s to 50s that are really effective at creating images in the mind through the use of text and music and sound effects. And so the radio opera I compose are designed to help the listener create their own images as they're listening along. Operas just, they're usually large works that I'm creating.
Yeah, sort of extraordinarily large, right? Now, one of the things that is interesting about this Invisible People is that you specifically want it to be presented in the darkness, which I think is actually a very interesting route, because with this idea of trying to propel people into developing images in their head or whatever, I think that doing that within the context of being in a dark room, I think you're putting them in a position of maybe discomfort, but also in a position of being able to sort of like stimulate their own mental magic, right?
Right. I mean, I think radio opera, there's a cooperation between, or a partnership between the composer and the audience, because, someone can be sitting in the audience and not choose to activate one's imagination, and they might not see or imagine anything as they're listening. But the first series of pieces that I composed using this term radio opera began with Invisible People. That you mentioned you listened to episode 1,
right,
which is actually episode 3, but kind of, I guess, Star Wars logic of numbering things. But so the very first episode was actually called a prologue, which, again, in the performance instructions, it specifies that it should be performed in a darkened theater. So, as dark as legally possible.
Right.
And it says uncomfortably, in an uncomfortably loud volume. The idea with this composition was that it was modular composition, meaning that it had all of these elements that can be reconfigured as part of the same series. And for each venue where it was performed, it would be a slightly different version, but still related to the same theme. And along those lines, there were experiments where I did one version of Indivisible People, which had projection. It had me off stage playing trumpet in addition to the multi-channel acousmatic elements. And it eventually evolved into a staged version, which had 2 actors, a female soprano singer, a soprano saxophonist who was off stage, and then a sound engineer running all of the fixed media pieces off stage, and also elements of interactivity. So through this initial radio opera, I've experimented with, lighting, no lighting, projection, no projection. And I really find that one of my favorite ways to present radio opera is in darkness.
Yeah, I would imagine. One of the things I would say in my experience, and I bet that you, in trying all these different experiments, you saw as well, is when you start putting imagery in front of a musical composition, it changes people's engagement with that. Now, for them, it becomes the music or the sound becomes the soundtrack of the visual rather than being the central composition point, right?
Absolutely. And I think one thing that was interesting to me with all of the compositions I create, to me, one of the most exciting parts is talking to people after they've, listened to or, experienced the radio operas, because the composition phase is this kind of isolated process, which, I'll spend a long time by myself. And so the only kind of, when it becomes a social activity is through the performance and hearing what people hear or how they interpret it, what they imagine, what they see. And so I would get a lot of comments when I would do the dark versions of any type of radio opera or, narrative composition of mine. Oh, that was great. Have you ever thought of adding, I saw this X, Y, and Z in my head. Have you thought of adding video to it? And so, as you've already noted, by adding the video or some type of visuals, it does take away from, I'm telling the listener what to see instead of their own imagination. And so, I like the idea that there can be infinite interpretations of the same piece.
Right. That's really powerful. Now, what you said, the other kind of work that you do is narrative soundscape composition, and how does that differ from the radio opera? What are sort of like the ideas that separate the two kinds of composition for you?
Okay, they're both forms rooted in electroacoustic composition,
right? And
both terms that I started using around the same time to describe my work. With the narrative soundscape composition, it's kind of, it owes a lot to, soundscape composition that was developed out of the World Soundscape Project in Vancouver. But I think part of the narrative aspects in my composition is that I'm working with a lot of field recordings to create these compositions. And I usually am building, I think the difference between the radio opera and the narrative soundscape composition, in some ways, I think maybe the narrative soundscape composition relies less heavily on text. It may have elements of human voice in it, but that's not necessarily the focus of it.
All right. Well, yeah, I mean, when you say that you're kind of using like field recordings and stuff, immediately that makes me think that the narrative soundscapes are maybe more about place than they are about a person or an event. Maybe but that might be simplifying it too much. I don't know.
I mean, I think I'm trying to, and I'm sure I will contradict myself because I'm still working this out. I've been trying to work this out for the past 7 years, or maybe 9 years. But I think with the narrative soundscape composition, putting that narrative in front of soundscape composition is to introduce more of the human element into it, as opposed to just place. How that is being done is something that I'm still in the process of developing.
Interesting. That's interesting. You've dropped a couple of nuggets here that I want to come back to, but before we go there, one of the things that's an important part of my podcast is talking to people about their background and how they became the artists that they are. And I'm curious for you, first of all, how did you get to the place where you were, you're comfortable as a composer, as well as someone who's willing to sort of like define almost their own genre by saying, I'm doing these radio operas. In a way, that's putting some stakes in the ground, saying that this is going to be my area of focus. What is it that drew you into that? And how did you feel about what is it that drew you into setting up establishing those kind of statements for yourself?
Well, I think my background in music may be similar to a lot of composers and musicians. I was introduced to music at a very early age. I started taking formal lessons. My mother enrolled me in the community center, and eventually trumpet became my primary instrument. There was dabbling with the piano and violin. But by the time I got to college, I knew I wanted to study composition, and I thought that what I would do with composition would be to return to LA, where I grew up, and do film scoring. And what happened when I was at college, I went to Columbia at a time when the electronic music center was being transitioned into the computer music center. And so this was the, early to mid 90s. And I think one of the greatest experiences during that time was being in this environment where I was making compositions using, reel-to-reel tape and splicing these sounds that were, designed using oscillators. And there's something about the splicing and moving these pieces of tape around to create new pieces of music. Having that background before I actually began working in computer music, it still plays a role in my composition now, 20 years later or so, even though more than 20. But the point is, there's something about this kind of tactile approach to working with sound as a early point in working with electronic or electroacoustic music is still important to me in the way I think about sound. So even today, if I'm composing, I think about how I can take these pieces and apply, similar techniques to them. So I think there are two things that are kind of really important to what I'm doing today in 2020. And one is that experience in the mid 90s working with reel-to-reel before moving on to computer music. And then the second would be during the 90s and early 2000s, I lived in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I was working, first as a soundboard operator, then doing sound design for theater and radio drama. And so those two experiences or activities really shape, in terms of electroacoustic musicking and also the desire to think about sounds theatrically. And I guess I'll add one more influence, and that would be, at some point I had come across John Cage's The City Wears a Slouch Hat. And this idea, I don't know which came first, but for a long time I've had this idea of not composing for theater, but composing theater itself. And so composing these lines of text, composing the order of, the sound effects and everything. So I think those would be three major influences: the Electronic Music Center, San Francisco Theater area, and then this John Cage piece.
Right, but that actually makes a lot of sense, because listening to your work now, it would be very hard to imagine a freshman composition student, with a pad of a pad of staff paper, working their way into some of these things that combines environmental sound with spoken word, with historical documentation, all this stuff kind of melded together. But it does make sense when you take into account the idea of composition moving into the kinds of things that Columbia would have provided, as well as the influence of theater and the influence of space, the space of the performance, as well as John Cage's work, which, was very much about the development of acousmatic kind of concepts. Now, I just used that word, and I'm going to actually ask you, over the course of my podcast, I've had a number of people talk about acousmatic works, but normally they do it in a way that we just kind of the word gets tossed out there, and then we rush to the next concept. But I would really appreciate it if you, for the listeners, could describe how you think of acousmatic work.
I think about it in two ways, which probably are the same or similar. One, when I use the term acousmatic, I'm talking about sounds where you cannot see the source of the sound, of where it's being produced, or simply sounds that are coming out of loudspeakers.
Right,
so,
okay.
And then there's the whole myth of the term coming from the disciples of Pythagoras, who would get their lessons behind this screen and see him. But yeah, I generally mean just sounds that are composed specifically to be played back on speakers.
Right. Now, it's funny that the use of tape and splicing and stuff were so instrumental to your view. I actually have, one of my thumbs has this deep scar in it that was literally from, a mishap with a razor doing tape splicing. I spliced, I wish I would have spliced the two halves of my thumb together a little better than I did. But I too was in the middle of that. For me, it was working in a recording studio that was tape-based. But I found that there's something about that is really influential because of the way that it makes you think about segments of sound. It still holds today, even when I'm doing dialogue editing or when I'm doing sample editing for something like that. I tend to treat these individual segments of sounds almost like if they were those little pieces of tape, right? The important ones would be set to the side where I would come and splice them all together later. There are others that are tossed away, but somehow all of these little segments have importance to me in some way. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think about other, as you were talking, I was thinking about other experiences that also inform my current composition. For example, when I was living in San Francisco, I was the webcast and production director at Grace Cathedral, and I think I edited over 2,000 programs, a lot of them using voice and music materials. And so I think something about doing that routinely, although I wasn't creating a composition per se, something about just kind of reinforcing the way I edit and developing certain patterns doing that, and also the way that I mix and balance sound and think about space. It's true for everyone, but everything that is a part of my composition now comes from these varied experiences. Right.
So you come out of Columbia with some compositions in your satchel, and did you head out to San Francisco immediately, or were you involved in the New York compositional scene a bit?
Well, this is where I confuse people, because immediately after graduating, I started working on boats, first for a company in Battery Park that took out charters. And then when I came back
Did you say you started working on boats?
Yeah, so confused everyone, threw a loop.
Including me now. Yeah.
Yeah. But if you listen to my pieces, there's a lot of aquatic sounds that are owing to those experiences. So, I remained in New York for perhaps a summer after I graduated. And then when I went back to LA, where I'm from, I was trying to find boats to work on, and ended up, that's actually what brought me to San Francisco. And then the boats brought me, I was working on tall ships. and the tall ships actually brought me to theater. And if you think about there's a historic connection between the rigging of tall ships and the rigging in theater, but also a lot of my shipmates happen to be musicians and actors and writers and directors. So it was a detour, but not really, because it definitely influences. There's something about being out on the water and moving up and down for like 5 consecutive days that I would get these aural hallucinations, which then I think the easiest way to kind of recreate some of the sounds I was hearing was electroacoustically, or spectral composition, but
Yeah, well, that's really interesting. But also, I mean, what a crazy bunch of times. First of all, I had no idea that you would find a bunch of musicians and actors and stuff on a tall ship. I would have expected it would be all like grizzled sailing vets, right? So my vision of what being on board is very different. But I can just imagine the influence of that environment on your imagination of what soundscapes can be.
Yeah, I think also, even though I wasn't familiar with the term soundscape composition when I was doing these things, I think those experiences opened me up to listening in a way that is, similar to being practiced in things like sound walking and things like that. But just like hearing everything around me, hearing, distant buoys and bells and birds and the sound of the hawser making this this kind of low, kind of squeaky sound as it's being stretched between the dock and the pier, like all kinds of just really wonderful sounds I began to take interest in.
Sure, that sounds amazing. Now, once you started working in the theater as kind of a sound person, what did that bring to? Because again, that would have been very different from some of the experiences that you had leading into this. What did that add to the mix for you? What were the things that ended up what did the influences of that look like for your work?
Well, I think one of the best days for me, I was working in theater, but kind of theater adjacent, meaning I was working in the box office of Magic Theater, which is in Fort Mason. Right. And one day the production director said, "Hey, Yvette, are you free? We need a sound person, someone to run sound for this preview that's happening tonight." And I'm like, "Oh, okay." And I hadn't run sound for theater before, and I agreed to it. And the composer is David Molina, who's a very good friend now, but his sound design the play was a 3-hour play, and it was nonstop sound. I think the sound sources were something like 2 mini disc players, 2 CD players, and then I think there was at least 1 additional source. And it was constant, like multiple sounds happening at the same time. And it was basically like being thrown into, the pool to learn how to swim.
Right.
With, this award-winning director who was like, "Why are there horses sounding right now? There's no horses on the stage." But there was something that, after, I can't remember how long the show ran, maybe 2 months or something or less, I don't know. But there was something about once I got the hang of it, and, it was like the stage manager, it's kind of like the conductor, and David Molina as the composer of both, music and these sound effects that were being interwoven between the dialogue and actions of what was happening on the stage and interaction with the audience, with their responses, what is happening. And that was like, this is it. This is what I am interested for. Like running the soundboard became like playing a musical instrument. And it was an instrument that I wanted to compose for. And so I think that experience is probably one of the best experiences I had, early on to lead to what I now call radio opera.
Right. Well, it sounds like that would have been a real eye-opener because, again, I think most people's assumption would be that, there was maybe 1 CD and you would just like every once in a while hit play at a specific index. I think the idea of like your first gig being juggling all of these different machines. I mean, was it scored? Was there like a score that you had to follow, or was there somebody whispering in your ear? It's like the horses right now, go.
I considered the cue sheet to be kind of like a score in which you have, these cues that are organized by letter, and you have the stage manager telling you when to execute these. And each sound, has its own starting point. It may fade in, it may fade out, it may fade out for a specific duration, it may have a sharp dropout. There may be sound effects that are overlapped with one another. But all of this, it becomes very musical after a while. And I think this was like further developed just working like another Bay Area influence was I forgot whatever the title was, but I was working with sound with Joe Good Performance Group, which is a dance troupe that uses, well, obviously movement, but in addition to that, there is a lot of text and there is a lot of, so it would be these dancers that have microphones that have text, but then be slamming into one another and being able to smoothly bring in and out these mics while they may be singing or playing to music that is being played out, from various sources, again, like CD or computer or whatever. And so like the organization of all of these elements is something that I am currently working on and thinking about composing, not just using pitches, not just using found sounds, but introducing elements of movement into the score itself, introducing elements of lighting into the score itself, props as part of the score, etc.
That's really interesting and really smart. Now, it makes me want to, though, delve a little more into the idea of composition of the kind of work that you do and what the documentation process actually looks like. So, when people think of a score, they sometimes will think of like a great big pile of, again, notation paper that represents the pitches over time that an orchestra would play, right? In other cases, like you described with the theatrical production, you have a cue sheet. And a lot of times film production looks like this too, where there's sort of like a cue sheet that says, here's where these things go. And, placement and coordination with something else that's going on ends up being kind of a key part of how that documentation is developed. And quite frankly, then a lot of times for people, especially, whether you go back to the original tape composers or even to, sort of like current musicians, a lot of times it's much more improvisational, or it's sort of like the score is the end result. The thing that I end up doing, that's what I did, And so it's impractical to actually score that stuff ahead of time. What I'm wondering is, from your perspective, how do you organize before you create the piece? And then what is the process you go through in creating the piece? And then how do you present the documentation to others when they're either going to perform or in some way present the piece that you've done?
I have a few processes, and I'll start by giving you an example of one. So for Invisible People, which you've mentioned a few times, and for a lot of compositions, they usually all start with a conversation, because the themes that I'm working with, again, are about some current issue, or at least the current issue is, the seed of what the piece is about, or some historic event. So the conversation is usually the beginning point. And then there's some type of research. It could be archival research around that topic. It could be YouTube videos of people talking about whatever issue. It could be newspaper clippings, etc. Then I go into kind of sketching out ideas. That could be at a keyboard or on the trumpet, using some type of software, just sounds that I hear, or, making field recordings of things that I hear that I feel are relative to both the topic of the conversation and the research that I've done. The fourth stage usually involves some type of storyboarding, since narrative is the focus of, most of my composition. So usually I'll work in panels of 3. So I have these 3 scenes that I storyboard, thinking about a specific action or emotion or some image that inspires part of the narrative, and whatever comes to mind for each of these blocks gets developed. And then from the storyboard, then usually there's some type of scoring. And so the scoring can be a combination of things. It can be traditional notation. It can be some type of graphic notation. Sometimes it'll be verbal, like a verbal score of, this should happen, and that will happen, and that will happen.
Right.
After the scoring, for a lot of my electroacoustic piece, the radio operas at least, and maybe this is part of what you asked about the distinction between radio opera and the narrative soundscape composition, is I go into the studio with my chamber ensemble. So I have an ensemble I call them the Invisible People Ensemble, partly because they were initially brought together for Invisible People radio opera, and also because they're never seen. And with the studio ensemble, I present to the musicians, again, both traditionally notated music, sometimes graphic scores. Usually there'll be at least one free improvisation just to get people warmed up. So it's a combination of improvised and notated music created with the ensemble. And then, I'll do some solo takes with specific musicians. And with those Pro Tools sessions, I use part of that as the source material now in my, own studio, where I can, tear apart these different elements and create part of the narrative, again, returning to the storyboard that I earlier created. From that point, there's kind of this process where I may jump to any of the, revisit any of the points or phases that I mentioned of the process until it is, I won't say complete, because I feel I like to call my compositions living, because there's always, they're never done. They can always be modified and changed.
Right. Now, the thing that you do with Pro Tool files in your own studio, though, in a way that's sort of like kind of a real advanced means of arrangement, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, I'm curious, because of the level of detail that your compositions hold, I'm curious, how often do you get to the point where you start that arranging process and all of a sudden, in laying things out, a missing part is revealed, or an opportunity was revealed that you didn't see ahead of time, and then all of a sudden in the process of pulling things together, you're like, oh, I really need X. And then that puts you into sort of like a recycling of, okay, I need to write some more stuff and go back in the studio and develop more material. Is that cycle occurring a lot?
I like to use a process that I call destructive editing. So, and it's kind of a response to kind of non-destructive linear editing, where you can have as many undos as possible.
Right.
And to create this process, I usually work either in a series. Invisible People was created in a series of, or not series, but like in multiple studios, wherein I would, whatever I did in studio A, that's what I had from there. For studio B, whatever happened in that, during that phase, I'm not going to have the ability, or the ability to go back and make any changes for what happens in that second studio will be limited. Then I go into the next phase. And so, or, if I'm editing all in my home studio, I may do some things in Ableton, and then I may do some things in Digital Performer, and then I may go back to Ableton, and do it in a way that kind of, again, prohibits me from hitting too many undos. Initially, part of that would be like, if I make a mistake, like there is, a soundbite in Invisible People that is distorted, and I made a decision at, during one of the earlier stages that I wasn't going to fix it, fix the distortion, and so that was a part of the composition itself. The other thing is, as I'm composing, even though I have a storyboard or a score, I can still veer from it, because I still will prioritize listening and my interpretation of what I'm hearing as part of the composition process. Mm-hmm. So, for example, in another composition, Destination Freedom, I was using a modular setup that I had put together, and I can't remember the exact patch that I developed, but it sounded like there were voices speaking when there were none. And so I kind of used that to kind of create build a character that I called sirens, and I would place in the score when the sirens would come like in and out of the piece. Or, there's a lot of kind of misinterpreting sounds. And by that, I mean, taking something that originated as a musical, and I have that in quotations, as a musical phrase or a musical, passage, and trying to make it unmusical. And at the same time, taking things that might be considered unmusical, like the radiator in my apartment, and then trying to make that as musical as possible. And so that's where kind of like listening becomes an important part of the composition process itself.
So most of the stuff that we've described as your work is sort of like large format work. Do you have anything that you do that is like more intimate, or is doing, whether you frame it as the radio opera, and I guess the name opera even sort of like implies sort of a size or a significance kind of factor to it. And your narrative soundscapes again sound large. Do you ever do anything, whether for yourself or for other kinds of projects that are small or that represent a different kind of process? Or have you really, or do you really see yourself embracing this one direction as being the expression of your voice?
I mean, I think just as personally designed etudes, I create like shorter pieces where I will go in and usually using whatever digital audio workstation I'm using at the time, which again is usually either Digital Performer or Ableton. So I mean, I will use one of them and just like, okay, and I'm just going to make this short piece, and it may be maybe a project for the day where I'm going to make a 3-minute piece. Or I mean, I guess the short answer is yes. I've been building a catalog, a library of shorter pieces that are shorter compositions that primarily have been going on into building my own library, because my larger compositions, I'm always sampling myself. And so like these shorter etudes or shorter productions just kind of increase my library of things that I can draw from in my larger compositions. So
that makes a lot of sense too, because then it sort of builds a practice. The reason I was asking is, and it's just like personal curiosity, but when, like, again, with your work, I think of it being these really large format things, and I'm like, man, it would seem almost intimidating to start on something that I know is going to represent something with this level of heft to it, right? But right. having sort of a working process that says, hey, today I'm just going to work on an etude of some sort, or I'm going to work on a little piece that's just going to go in the library. That makes a lot of sense to me, in sort of a way of being creative and being more immediate while still serving the bigger goal. I like that.
Yeah, and I think, for example, I mentioned part of the larger process is this studio time with my ensemble. And, for the ensemble, I mean, we're creating pieces of music, whether they're scored or improvised. And, I do release those recordings as a separate project. So, I have I can release an EP of these sessions, which is, I consider to be like the pure, unadulterated form of these pieces. And then, I have these, elements from those pieces that are in these larger works. And one thing I find that's interesting, especially like when programming my works for like larger, shows, is that because each piece has like an element of a previous piece, like all the pieces are connected. And like, I think like in curating pieces, it kind of creates a nice flow, because even if they're a different approach or a different style, there is some kind of overlap between these various compositions.
Right. Well, Yvette, unfortunately, our time is up. But before we go, for people who would be interested in hearing more of your work, I obviously have been yammering on about it since we started talking. Where would people go? Where would you like to send people to have them hear your work and learn more about the pieces that you've created?
For a general overview, people can go to my website, which is YvetteJackson.com. So YvetteJackson.com. And there's some snippets. People are always welcome to email me because I do have a few pages that are hidden from the main website. And this year I've started a new ensemble called the Radio Opera Workshop. So there will be some live performances of radio opera. So I'm looking forward to that.
That sounds fantastic. I am really excited to hear more and get more involved in the work that you're doing. I really appreciate it. And I want to thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to have this talk as well.
Well, I really appreciate you inviting me. It's been a great conversation.
Yeah, indeed it has. All right. Well, with that, I'm going to let you have the rest of your day. We'll talk to you again soon.
All right. Thanks a lot.
All right. Bye. What a great interview. Thanks so much to Yvette for having that great talk. If you want to learn more, make sure you go over to YvetteJackson.com or take a peek at our show notes for links to everything. Beyond that, I want to thank Seth Cluett for helping out with getting this first interview in the series established. And I want to thank all the people who are Patreon patrons. They are really helping out. If you're interested in becoming a patron, please check out patreon.com/DarwinGrosse. That's DarwinGrosse. I really appreciate the financial help. This helps pay the bills for keeping the lights on here at the podcast, as well as helping pay for transcription service and some of the other functions that we have going on here. I really do appreciate everyone that chips in. I also appreciate all of those of you who share the podcast, who are fans of the podcast, who talk about it on Facebook, on Instagram, on Twitter. I really do appreciate you sharing the message, and I hope you continue to do so. But with that, I'm going to let you go for the week. Thank you so much, and we'll catch you next time around. Bye.